The paper on the notice board was damp at the corners, curling from river mist, and the black letters on it were plain enough for anyone to read. Crane Apprenticeship Intake. Men only. Iona stood there with diesel in the air, chain clatter overhead, and her application folded warm in her hand when Foreman Busk took one look at her name and signed the rejection like he was initialing a delivery slip. He didn't raise his voice. Men like that rarely need to. "The cab is no place for a woman," he said, sliding the paper back across the counter. "And this dockside is no place for your ambition." That landed harder than shouting would have. Around them, boots scraped concrete. A forklift beeped in reverse. Somebody laughed down the shed as if nothing at all had happened. That was the part that stayed with her later. Not just the insult, but how ordinary it was to everybody else. As if a door could be shut in your face and the whole harbor would keep breathing without missing a beat. Iona was the daughter of a tally clerk. She had grown up around cargo lists, wet ropes, rust-streaked steel, and men who smelled like rain and machine grease by noon. She knew what moved through that port, and she knew something else, too. The cranes did not care who was looking up at them. Weight was weight. Timing was timing. A bad lift was a bad lift. So she took the rejected form, folded it once, then twice, and tucked it into her pocket. Busk had already turned to the next man in line when she looked past him, out toward the gantry crane, and quietly said, "Then I'll learn without you." If you want to stay with Iona's story, like the video and subscribe, because that was the moment everything began to change. After that, she kept showing up before dawn like she always had. The port did not soften for anybody. It smelled of wet timber, old rope, coffee gone bitter in metal flasks, and the sharp, oily breath of machines warming up in the dark. Iona checked tallies for her father when the stack got too high, counted pallets, matched tags, walked manifests from one shed to the next with cold wind pushing at her jacket. Work like that teaches you something early. Places built on labor can still make a person feel invisible. She knew the rhythm of the harbor better than most men who talked over her. Which truck lines stalled first when rain slowed the ramps? Which crews cut corners when the shift boss looked away? Which loads made everybody tense before they were even lifted? She watched the crane cabs track slow across the gray morning and felt that same pull in her chest. Not because they looked grand, but because everything below answered to timing, balance, and judgment. That week, she started lingering near the weighbridge on her way back from the freight sheds, just enough to look. An old man sat there most mornings on a scarred wooden stool, cap pulled low, one ear turned useless to the world. Pruett, retired signalman. Half the dock treated him like leftover equipment that had never been cleared away. Then, one raw afternoon, while she paused beside a crate ledger and stared at a load chart clipped under a rusted weightboard, his voice came out rough as gravel. "You're reading it like a grocery list," he said. Iona looked up. Pruett tapped the paper with one bent finger, squinted at her, and added, "If you want, I can show you what that thing is really saying." From then on, her breaks began to disappear. Officially, Iona still had the same duties, the same boots wet through by mid-morning, the same pencil tucked behind one ear while she checked tags and freight slips. But whenever she could steal 10 minutes near the weighbridge, Pruett would jerk his chin at the nearest crate, cable, or scribbled note and turn it into a lesson. He did not talk to impress her. He talked like a man tightening bolts. Plain, direct, no wasted motion. A load chart, he told her, was not numbers sitting still on paper. It was a warning, a promise, a mistake waiting to happen if the wrong fool looked at it too fast. He made her trace weight lines with one rough finger. He made her picture where the pull would shift, where the strain would travel, which corner would go light first. When she answered too quickly, he grunted. When she guessed, he stopped speaking until she started thinking. Then he moved to signals. Because radios crackled, batteries died, engines drowned out voices, and pride made men miss what was right in front of them. So he taught her the hand signal code the old way, slow at first, then faster, until she could read emotion from the corner of her eye. Hoist, hold, swing, lower, stop. Again, again, again. Her shoulders would ache from carrying ledgers all day, and still she stayed until the cold got into her fingers. You learn a lot about people in places like that. Some will lock a gate. A rarer few will quietly hand you tools. One damp evening, as the last light faded off the sheds, Pruett reached into his coat and pulled out a grease-smudged notebook. "I'm not lending this to be admired," he said. "Open it." She opened it that night at the small kitchen table she shared with her father's paperwork. The notebook smelled faintly of machine oil and old rain. Its pages were warped, edges dark from years in a coat pocket, and every sheet was packed tight with penciled sketches, quick sums, little warnings in the margins, useful notes, angles, load paths, signal marks, reminders about wind, swing, blind corners, men who rushed, men who guessed, and the price paid when they did either one. From then on, her days split in two. At the port, Iona kept her head down and her body moving. She hauled forms, checked counts, crossed slick concrete with clipboards tucked under her arm, and answered to people who still saw her as extra hands, nothing more. At home, she copied diagrams until her fingers cramped. She redrew yard lanes from memory. She tested herself on timing, sequencing, weight balance. Some nights, the kettle went cold beside her before she remembered to pour it. And little by little, she began to see things before they happened. Just pattern. A stack placed too far forward. A truck line building where it shouldn't. A lift crew wasting motion because someone set the order wrong from the start. Once, during a wet afternoon shift, she watched a foreman wave 3 flatbeds into the same narrow lane and felt her stomach tighten. She said, quiet but clear, "That's going to jam." Nobody listened. 10 minutes later, engines were idling nose to tail, tempers were up, and a driver was leaning on his horn hard enough to rattle the shed glass. Iona didn't smile. She only watched, and realized knowing was not the same as being allowed to matter. The next evening, Pruett looked at her for a long moment and said, "That's exactly why this place may never be the one that lets you rise." She did not answer him right away. The two of them were standing near the edge of the yard, where the evening air carried river damp, hot metal, and that faint burnt smell from brakes used too hard. Somewhere above, a crane trolley groaned along its track. Iona kept her eyes on the lane that had jammed, on the men now untangling a mess she had seen coming, and she understood what Pruett meant before he said another word. "This place knows what you are," he told her. "And worse than that, it thinks it already decided what you'll never be." That was the hard truth of it. She had skill. She had grit. The port had made up its mind about her before she ever filled out that first form. Some places do that. They don't just close the door. They build their comfort on keeping it closed. The next few days, she worked with that sentence sitting in her chest like a stone. She still checked freight lists for her father, still crossed the yard with cold spray needling her face, still kept learning from the notebook at night. But now, every task had a second question under it. If not here, then where? The answer came in a way almost too ordinary to notice. A hiring notice had been pinned crooked on a board beside the dispatch office, half hidden under an invoice sheet and a safety memo. Another terminal, deeper water, bigger traffic, stricter planning desk, was looking for a junior yard planner. Experience preferred. Strong logistics sense required. Iona read it once, then again. She had no title, no formal training paper, no one there waiting to open a gate for her. That night, she carried the posting to Pruett, set it on the stool between them, and he glanced down at it like he'd been expecting the paper all along. Then he asked the one thing she had been afraid to hear. "Well," he said, "are you brave enough to be new somewhere else?" For 2 days, she carried that question around like a weight in her coat. Iona did what people do when they are half afraid of their own next step. She kept moving. She checked tallies, crossed the yard through mist and grit, answered short to men who never noticed when she was thinking hard. At night, she sat with the hiring notice beside Pruett's notebook, reading both until the words blurred. Junior yard planner. Experience preferred. Just possible. Her father Neil found her there one late evening, with cold tea by her elbow and freight dust still on her sleeves. He read the notice in silence, thumb rubbing the edge of the page. Neil was not a man of speeches. Years of counting other people's cargo had taught him that most things in life were heavier than they first looked. "Do you want the job?" he asked, "or do you want this port to finally say yes?" That was the right question, because those are not the same thing. One is a future, the other is permission. And if you wait too long for permission from people who feel safe saying no, you can spend half your life standing still. So she filled out the application at the same scarred table where she had copied notes by hand. She wrote down everything she knew how to do, even if no one had ever paid her to do it under the proper title. Yard flow, freight sequencing, spotting preventable delays, reading operations before they broke. The interview invitation came faster than she expected, and when she saw the name of the terminal at the top of the letter, her stomach tightened. Because this place was bigger, busier, and far less forgiving than the one that had turned her away. She almost turned the interview down twice before she ever got there. Wanting had never been the problem. It was the size of the chance. The new terminal was a different world. Higher stacks, faster turnarounds, tighter schedules, more steel in the air, and less patience for mistakes. Even the yard sounded different when she first arrived. Deeper engine noise, sharper radio chatter, the hard slam of containers setting down in steady rhythm. Iona wore her cleanest work shirt, carried her papers in a plain folder, and tried not to grip it too tightly. The interview was held in a square office that smelled like coffee, damp jackets, and printer heat. No one there asked whether a crane cab was a place for her. That much, all by itself, almost threw her off. They asked about lane flow, delay points, what she would do when timing failed in one section and the backlog started spreading. One manager slid a rough yard sketch across the table and said, "Tell us where this goes wrong." So she did. She pointed to the choke point near incoming loads, the wasted turn in the routing, the blind handoff that would back trucks into each other by mid-shift. She spoke carefully at first, then more firmly when she saw they were listening, not smiling to be polite. That can shake a person too, you know. Being dismissed is one kind of pain. Being taken seriously after you've been trained to expect the opposite, that can make your hands tremble just as much. They thanked her and said they'd be in touch. By the time she got back to the riverport, the wind had picked up, and Pruett was waiting by his stool as if he'd heard her footsteps coming. He looked at her face once and asked, "How honest were you?" Iona blinked. "What?" "With them," he said. "Did you tell them what you really see?" She knew exactly what he meant. If she had played small in that room, if she had answered like someone begging to be liked, then the interview would have been over before she reached the gate. So she told Pruett the truth. Yes, she had said what she saw. Yes, she had pointed out flaws on their sketch. Yes, she had spoken like a person who expected her own judgment to count. The old man gave one short nod, almost hidden under the brim of his cap. "Good," he said. "Ports don't need more timid people. They've already got plenty." 3 mornings later, the offer came. It wasn't a grand position, no fancy title, no polished office, no magic doorway opening at once. Junior yard planner, trial period, hard hours, reporting to people who would expect results fast and excuses never. Iona read the letter standing by the dispatch wall, with damp air on her face and the yard already rumbling awake around her. For a second, she felt relief so strong it almost made her lightheaded. Then came the other feeling, leaving. She had spent so long trying to force a future out of one place that walking away from it felt strange, even when walking away was the right thing. Her father hugged her awkwardly the night she told him. Freight dust still clung to his cuffs. "I'm proud of you," he said, and because he did not waste words, that landed deep. Pruett was harder. He took the news without surprise, like a man hearing the tide had done what tides do. But before she left, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded slip of paper, and pressed it into her hand. "Don't open it yet," he said. "Open it when the new place reminds you that being new can feel a lot like being unwelcome." The new terminal was harder from the very first week. Just unsentimental. No one cared where Iona had come from, who had doubted her, or how much she had wanted the chance. Freight still had to move. Schedules still had to hold. If she made a mistake, containers would stack in the wrong order. Drivers would lose time, crews would lose patience, and everyone would know by the end of the hour. She started before sunrise and went home with salt on her jacket and dust in the seams of her hands. Her desk was not much more than a scarred surface near the yard windows, but from there she had to track arrivals, flag bottlenecks, and think 3 steps ahead of men twice her age. At first, they tested her in small ways. A half answer over the radio, a late update, a look that said, "Let's see if you can keep up." So she did not talk big. She listened, watched, wrote everything down, and learned the pulse of the place. Which lanes backed up after weather? Which supervisor delayed decisions too long? Which rushed fixes only made the next hour worse? Some nights she sat in her room with aching shoulders and wondered if Pruett had known exactly how lonely this part would feel. On the 4th bad day, after a shift that seemed determined to go wrong from every direction, she finally unfolded the slip he had given her. The paper was creased soft from her pocket. On it, in his blunt handwriting, were just 2 lines. "Being new is not the same as being wrong. Stand where the work proves you right." She read it once, then tucked it away. The next morning, just before noon, the yard lurched toward its first real mess with her on duty, and this time, no one senior was stepping in. What hit the yard just before noon was the kind of trouble that starts small enough for people to underestimate it. One truck arrived late, then another arrived early, and a container set meant for one lane was dropped near another because a radio message got clipped halfway through. By itself, none of that should have broken the shift. Together, it started bending everything out of shape. Engines idled in the wrong places. Drivers craned out their windows. A supervisor was off dealing with a customs hold, and the planner above Iona had stepped away to a meeting no one could interrupt quickly. So there she was, new, untested, and suddenly the closest thing the yard had to a clear pair of eyes. She looked once through the window, once at the board, and once at the incoming list. Then she stood up and started calling changes. Hold 2 trucks at the outer lane. Reverse the drop order on the next pair. Pull 1 waiting unit around the back route before the middle section locked up. Her voice did not come out loud, but it came out steady. A few people hesitated. One driver frowned at her through the glass. Another supervisor asked, You sure? That is the moment people rarely talk about. Not the big triumph later. This one. The thin, lonely second when you either trust what you know or step back and watch the mess get bigger. I'm sure, she said. And for once, the yard listened. But enough. The pressure eased. The line straightened. The bad half hour stopped spreading into a ruined afternoon. When the senior planner finally came back, he stood by the board, took in the reroutes, and turned to her with a look she had not seen before. Who changed this sequence? Iona still had her pen in her hand when she answered. I did. He said nothing for a beat, then pulled a chair toward her desk. What came after that was not applause. It was work. More of it, and harder. The senior planner, a spare man named Calder, did not praise people to make them feel good. He dragged the chair closer, pointed at the board, and said, If you're going to change my sequence, you're going to explain every move. So she did. Lane by lane, delay by delay. Calder listened with his jaw set, then grunted once and told her to sit back down. From there, things shifted in the plain way real life often does. No ceremony, just more responsibility landing on her desk. Iona started getting copied on route changes, berth timing notes, staffing gaps, equipment delays. She learned that yards were not saved by one smart call. They were saved by seeing trouble before it grew teeth. She stayed late, arrived early, ate too many meals standing up, and learned which numbers mattered more than the ones people liked putting in reports. Turn times, missed handoffs, bad sequencing passed off as bad luck. And as the months rolled into years, she learned something bigger, too. A port is not only steel, schedules, and weather. It is paperwork, rules, signatures, the wording of notices pinned to walls, the little official sentences that decide who gets trained, who gets trusted, who gets to enter the room before a person has even opened their mouth. You and I both know that's how plenty of places work. They hide unfairness inside process, then call it policy. By then, Iona was no longer just surviving the terminal. She was becoming useful in ways that reached beyond the yard. Then, one evening, after a long shift and a stack of operation summaries, Calder stopped at her desk and said, Management wants you upstairs tomorrow. Don't guess why, just be ready. She did as Calder told her and went upstairs without trying to guess. The offices above the yard always felt like a different climate. Less diesel in the air, more stale coffee and printer heat. Carpet instead of grit underfoot. Windows that looked down on the work as if distance could make it cleaner. Iona sat across from two senior managers with a folder on the table between them and kept her hands still in her lap. They did not waste time. The terminal had expanded. Her numbers were strong. Her shift decisions had been steady. Her reporting was clear, and crews listened when she spoke. First came more responsibility, then title changes, then years that seemed to move in long, hard stretches of winter mornings and late evening calls. Yard planner became senior planner. Senior planner became operations lead. The work got bigger every time. More staffing charts, more maintenance windows, more meetings where one bad choice on paper could throw a whole dock into confusion by noon. And through all of it, she kept learning what power really looked like. Power in places like that was often quieter than swagger or noise. Quieter than a man leaning over a counter, telling you what kind of future is allowed to belong to you. It was the person who signed the notice, the person who approved training, the person who could change one line of policy and open a gate for people who had never even been invited to knock. Then one gray afternoon, after years of proving herself in every weather and every shift, they slid a new folder toward her. A struggling harbor in the company network needed a new operations director. Safety intake was outdated. Training pipelines were thin. Delays were spreading. Someone had to go in and straighten it out. Iona opened the folder, and the first thing she saw was the name of the river port she had once left behind. She did not say yes on the spot. By then, Iona knew what she could do. She knew how to read a failing shift before it became a failing week. She knew how bad wording on a form could turn into bad culture on a dock. What stopped her for a moment was something quieter than fear. Memory. The harbor in that folder was not just another assignment. It was the same place where damp paper on a notice board had once told her what she was not allowed to become. The same place where Busk had signed his name under Men Only and said the dockside was no place for her ambition. Some wounds do not ache every day, but they remember the weather. She took the folder home, set it on her table, and sat with it long after dark. Outside, rain tapped the window in thin, steady lines. Inside, she turned pages filled with delay reports, staffing gaps, training shortages, old procedures no one had bothered to fix. It was all there in black and white. A port that had grown comfortable with doing things the narrow way, because that was the way it had always been done. By morning, her answer was ready. The return was quiet. No announcement trumpets, no dramatic entrance. Just a car pulling in before dawn, tires hissing on wet pavement, and a woman stepping out in a clean coat with the authority of her office carried plain in a folder under one arm. The yard looked smaller than it had in memory. The sheds, the lanes, even the old office windows. Busk was still there, older now, thicker through the waist, less iron in the shoulders, but still there. And in the first morning briefing, while voices traded routine updates and paperwork changed hands, one document slid across the table toward her for approval. Iona looked down and saw the apprenticeship intake notice. She read the page once, then laid it flat on the table with the side of her hand. The room was quiet, except for the hum of old lights and the rattle of rain against the office window. Same notice, same narrow sentence, dressed up in fresher formatting, as if new paper could make an old wrong respectable. Busk saw what she was looking at. He shifted in his chair, waiting for her to initial it and move on. Instead, Iona uncapped her pen. She crossed out Men Only. Then, in clean block letters, she wrote, "Open to all qualified applicants." No speech, no grand pause, just one line replaced by another, followed by updated standards beneath it. Skill requirements, safety benchmarks, supervised assessments, documented scoring. If the door was going to open, it would open on rules no one could twist in the dark. Busk cleared his throat. That's not how we've done it. Iona signed the bottom of the page and slid it back across the table. It is now. By the end of that week, the first intake stood in the yard under a gray morning sky, boots lined on wet concrete, faces tight with hope. She reviewed the scores herself. 2 women made the cut, along with men who had earned it honestly. Busk brought the certification sheet to her office later, because without her approval, the apprentices could not be assigned. That was the whole turn of it. Just his hand, waiting where hers had once been, refused. Some gates do not fall with a crash. Sometimes they open with a pen stroke, and the sound is softer than rain. At dusk, Iona paused by the old yard window and watched the new trainees cross toward the cabs, small beneath the steel and steady on their feet. The harbor kept moving, but it no longer moved the same way. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe. There's always another one waiting, just beyond the next gate.